If you look at the etymology of most animals, you'll probably find out that it means something like the brown one or the spotted one. But Proto-Indo-European had a word for many of these. Granted, it was probably something like the brown one or the spotted one, but I just wanted an excuse to do the linguistic evolution. So, wolf, which in theory means the evil one, is preserved in the modern English word wolf. However, there are a few inconsistencies in its phonological history. First of all, the vowel here is actually a U, hence the British pronunciation of wolf. In theory, a mutation should lower it into an O, which is then lengthened for wolf. Now, this is a minor thing compared to the final consonant. Hua in Proto-Indo-European becomes the hua in modern English. Now, this does not mean wolf, because it would be spelled like this in the middle of a word, but more importantly, it disappears next to L and lengthens the preceding vowel. In accordance with the modern vowel, this would yield wowel, and with a mutation, it would be wool. Obviously, the most famous example of this would be bear. Famously, the original form that produced Arctic and Ursine is absent from English due to the fact that it spawns a bear if you say it too often. Now, Randall Munro's associate aimed for arth, which is inaccurate for a number of reasons. For one thing, the H2 doesn't have an effect on the unpacked U from the syllabic R, and for tenuous consonants, Grimm's law only affects the first in a cluster, so that would give us Proto-Germanic urchtar. However, there's also an alternative form with these consonants swapped that would give us urthkar. However, that would also bring it into analogy with other coast words which are usually stressed on the ending and voiced by Werner's law and also have a thematic vowel, so that would then be urthagar. This could then be lowered by a mutation, but it also could not be. Wolf wasn't. Some people also predict a metathesis here in the default root, ending in rot, which is probably likely, but feels unnecessary. From now on, we're doing it in alphabetical order by the name in German, which is the most convenient way for reasons. That means starting with the eel. This word, henquis, is used to mean snake and is extended to give us the Greek and Latin words for eel. Now, when I started this, I was really hoping it would be angrilage, and then the Ingvaeonic nasal spirant law removes the N for aril, and then the G drops off, and it still ends up being eel, but unfortunately G doesn't soften, as we see in songs. So I decided to go with hunquelos, which becomes Proto-Germanic unguilage. This vowel umlauts to U, the W is lost, and we would end up with Ingel. Fortunately, this is already the name of a strange fireplace thing, so it would be by analogy. Eagle is loaned from Latin, which is itself a word for the dark one. Hero is the original Proto-Indo-European form, and we would expect Germanic aro, which is what we get. However, Proto-Indo-European long O endings are so-called N stems, which often influence the lemma, so the very dialectical English form we have is earn. However, there are words like anchor that don't have the lemma influenced, and if that never happened to English, we would expect air. Not entirely sure how they would spell it, though. We'll skip over a few. Beaver, bee, goose, and elk are all accurate to Proto-Indo-European, and mire is a pretty obsolete term used to refer to an ant, like annet is for duck. Over to bass, these are named for having spines. Perch, which is basically the same animal, is from Greek, which is from spotted. However, the same word refers to a similar fish in Celtic and a Germanic term for trout. Now, this prkne is not the same derivative used in both Greek and Celtic. That's perkos. This potentially has two reflexes, ferchas and ferrage, after being affected by Werner's law. In theory, it should be affected because it uses a stressed os ending. On the other hand, that means both syllables appear to be unstressed. The ending is only voiced by analogy. Now, the Werner's law version is nearly identical to bergage, mountain, so it would almost certainly yield pharaoh. Additionally, pharaoh is already a word in English from farage, which is cognate with pork. Additionally, the version unaffected by Werner's law has variation in H loss in English, where the singular form is the unlengthened feoch, but the plural is the lengthened feoras. Now, there is a word feoch, which means life, specifically in the context of being threatened. This was spelled the exact same as fear in Middle English, so I think the most likely is fear. That being said, I do prefer the one with Werner's law. Badger in Spanish is tejon. This is ultimately from the Proto-Germanic thachsur, which is apparently cognate with this Celtic tascos. That would become thax in modern English, potentially fix if Mercian has an especially prominent effect, but considering flax by analogy, it's unlikely. Squirrel or martin is referred to using the root wer. Yes, This root does also mean 20 other things, so we mostly see it as the reduplicated form in Latin and the Baltic and Celtic languages. Germanic also has a similar one, so I'm going to try and make that the mimic of the reduplicated form, as wewerno. Wewerno in Proto-Germanic, and no matter what happens in Old English, this is probably not staying as 2 syllables. My best guess is that these syllables merge into a long vowel, which then shortens behind 2 consonants and is spelled like wern by analogy to learn. On the other side, we have this sick metathesis that happens. It happened to burn too, and then is spelled the exact same way. The word for fly isn't perfectly clear, but a root like mouse consistently shows up. It's usually feminine, so I'll go with the ending neh, which puts the root in O grade. By Proto-Germanic, that would be mausno. This would probably give us something like mosen. There's no real way to account for this ending cluster. Moan or mos are probably also likely. Roe or roan are descendants of the PIE word for frog spawn. Shad is from the same source as Celtic words for herring. Hawk is cognate with a lot of birds of prey, and since they all use the same word, falcon is hawk too. A whale is referred to with the same term that produced squalus, which is shark in Latin. In theory, shark would then just be whale. If it needs to contrast, shale or quail. Fox comes from a word for the tailed one, and vulpes, as well as Sanskrit laupasa and Greek alapex, are from something involving an H2, LP, and maybe a W. Now, the ending has to be feminine because it's a fox, so which in theory could use 0 grade or O grade. That means for Proto-Germanic I could see any of the following forms: walvo, wulvo, lavo, lauvo. By analogy to wolf, any of these could be unaffected by Werner's law, but that doesn't really matter because intervocalic B turns into F in English. By analogy to brain, I would expect blavo, but bravo is possible. So, wolv, wolve, blave, rave, or love. I'm most partial to blave by analogy to the Celtic languages. Vixen would then use the alternative form to be reven. The word hen is cognate with cantalo, meaning the one who sings. The root that produces avian shows up pretty consistently throughout the Indo-European family, but never in Germanic, using the feminine form of ilage, which was used for eel and tends to be used for animals. That produces heuele, which is Proto-Germanic awilon. By analogy to you, and also just because umlaut, we would probably expect Yule or Yule. The Spanish camarón and the French homard are 2 forms of the same PIE root, reconstructed as kmheros, but most likely from a substrate of some kind. We know the Proto-Germanic is humarar, which would be Homer if a mutation actually does its job, but we all know it won't, and Norse will probably have an effect, so Hummer. The root that gives echidna and yogic also gave a Proto-Germanic igilage, which almost made it to modern English. If it did, it would be isle. Hound is the accurate derivative, while dog is uncertain in origin. Rabbit is Norman in origin, while hare is from Germanic. Crane shifted to crow. Sparrow is accurate. Lox is a Yiddish-derived word for salmon, cognate with lax in English. Both louse and nit are accurate, and so is mouse. Horse is from one of 2 words, originally meaning vehicle, though the other remained widespread down into Old English. If allowed into modern English, it would be a. Ewe is the word for sheep. Wasp is accurate. Otter is accurate, showing how a mutation really doesn't care and just does whatever it feels like. Snake in most languages is related to eel without the infix, so it would just be ing. Kelheu is a root that shows up only in the Greek and Slavic words for turtle, but it's the only thing to work off of. Turtles are feminine, so I'll ablaut it together as gelhuhe. By Proto-Germanic, this becomes gelo, and is probably reanalyzed as a neuter noun, which is most likely yield by modern English, potentially with back mutation, but that doesn't affect the pronunciation. Most words for snail tend to be formed off of this root, which means slippery and gives English slime. Sow and swine are cognates with the words sus and suin in Latin. Greek and Slavic have cognates too. Spider is hard to track. However, aranea in Latin is not specifically derived from arachne in Greek. They're from a common source, even though that source is most likely not Indo-European. It's tough because this A is short in Greek but long in Latin. That's the difference between aragno and arogno, which in turn is the difference between arain and arone. I do think it's likely to be stressed on the final syllable by analogy with prefix A words. It depends on how much English of this setting is affected by Norman. The word for a grouse, pheasant, or some sort of game bird is tetruos, which becomes theduraj in Proto-Germanic. That's reconstructed based on the existing Old Norse word for a wood grouse. That would become English thither, though I think this vowel is shortened by analogy to tether and nether, leaving feather. Ermine is related to the word for weasel, but through French, directly from Proto-West Germanic, would be harmo, which would be harm. The cognate for goat made it all the way to Old English, and would probably be haver if it wasn't influenced by heifer, which it might be, so I think hiver isn't a bad guess either. Butterflius papaltos has cognates in Latin, Germanic, Slavic, and at least one Iranian language. The Germanic form is fifaldo, which would become fivalda in Old English, or fifalda with ash brightening. Either way, these would be reduced, and we would get fiveled. But I also have the sneaky prediction that the V disappears, which is not unprecedented, and it merges with field. Alright, if anyone has any ideas for future videos, hit me, because I'm desperate.